This is the 500 Greatest Albums from Rolling Stone. Introduction by Elton John. Great albums ought to be short. The shorter the better. If I see a CD with 17 tracks, I groan. Great albums are the ones you always go back to, like Aretha Franklin's I Never Loved a Man the Way I Love You. It's a perfect record, and I return to it time and time again. Exile on Main Street is the finest rock and roll album ever made, even though it's 18 tracks. Kanye West 808's and Heartbreak is as sexy as a Marvin Gaye album. I still play it, and it cracks me up every time. Singles are great, and I love pop music, but the album changed music for the better. My first album was Dusty Springfield's Dusty. Such an astonishing voice. Later, when Bernie Taupin and I shared an apartment, the biggest joy we had was buying a new album and looking at the sleeve while we played it. Marvin Gaye's What's Going On changed the face of black music forever. With an album like that, you'd play the first side, get up and take a breather, and then put on the other side. There was something magical about that. One day, I bought 4 big JBL speakers and put them in a big room at my house and put on Kraftwerk's Trans-Europe Express. I smoked a joint and almost thought I saw God. In the 60s and 70s, you could buy 12 albums a week that were all classics. I remember buying my first copy of Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. It was 1967 and I was 20. I biked to a village called Hat's End in northwest London. The album had one of the first gatefold sleeves, and I had to cycle back with one hand because I didn't want to ruin the cover. It was like someone had invented something new. Revolver is when the Beatles really became a band, and George started writing songs like Taxman. It came out at a time when I was playing with a band called Bluesology in the south of France. That summer, 1966, was all about Revolver. It's hard to judge my own stuff. Goodbye Yellow Brick Road was a bloody good double album, but I thought Blue Moves was more sophisticated. The band's second album changed the way I wrote songs. You can hear it in my writing on Tumbleweed Connection. Laura Neo's Eli and the 13th Confession and New York Tendaberry changed songwriting for me. She didn't just do verse-chorus songs, she went off on tangents and it all made perfect sense. Chet Baker Sings is one of the most heartbreaking albums of all time. I send that to people all the time and say, you don't have to be a great singer to move people. You can affect people by the emotion in your voice. Bob Dylan's Nashville Skyline and Modern Times sound like they were recorded in the 1940s or 1950s, but they sound like silk. Those were the templates for me when I made The Union. Thank God people are still making albums. I've never downloaded a song in my life, and I don't want to. I remember playing Eminem's The Marshall Mathers LP in a car driving to a show, and I listened to the whole thing. I was in a trance because his energy is so amazing. Arcade Fire's Neon Bible is astonishing. The energy just jumps off the CD. That album is going to survive. Look at Adele's 21. People love it and are moved by it. They put it on and it changes the way they feel about life and makes them happy or sad. It's a great album, and it's not too long. Number 1. Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band by the Beatles. Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band is the most important rock and roll album ever made, an unsurpassed adventure in concept, sound, songwriting, cover art, and studio technology by the greatest rock and roll group of all time. From the title song's regal blasts of brass and fuzz guitar, to the orchestral seizure and long, dying piano chord at the end of A Day in the Life, the 13 tracks on Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band are the pinnacle of the Beatles' 8 years as recording artists. John Lennon, Paul McCartney, George Harrison, and Ringo Starr were never more fearless and unified in their pursuit of magic and transcendence. Issued in Britain on June 1, 1967, and a day later in America, Sgt. Pepper is also rock's ultimate declaration of change. For the Beatles, it was a decisive goodbye to matching suits, world tours, and assembly line record making. We were fed up with being Beatles, McCartney said decades later in Many Years From Now, Barry Miles' McCartney biography. We were not boys, we were men, artists rather than performers. At the same time, Sgt. Pepper formally ushered in an unforgettable season of hope, upheaval, and achievement, the late 1960s, and in particular, 1967's Summer of Love. In its iridescent instrumentation, lyric fantasies, and eye-popping packaging, Sgt. Pepper defined the opulent revelatory optimism of psychedelia and instantly spread the gospel of love, acid, Eastern spirituality, and electric guitars around the globe. No other pop record of that era or since has had such an immediate, titanic impact. This music documents the world's biggest rock band at the very height of its influence and ambition. It was a peak, Lennon told Rolling Stone in 1970, describing both the album and his collaborative relationship with McCartney. Paul and I were definitely working together, McCartney said, and Sgt. Pepper is rich with proof. McCartney's burst of hot piano in School Days' memoir, in Lennon's A Day in the Life, A Reverie on Mortality and Infinity, and Lennon's impish rejoinder to McCartney's chorus in Getting Better. Sgt. Pepper was our grandest endeavor, Starr says, looking back on the band's 2000 autobiography, The Beatles Anthology. The greatest thing about the band was that whoever had the best idea, didn't matter who, that was the one we'd used. It was Neil Aspinall, the Beatles' longtime assistant, who suggested they reprise the title track just before the finale of A Day in the Life to complete Sgt. Pepper's theatrical conceit, an imaginary concert by a fictional band played by the Beatles. The first notes went to tape on December 6, 1966, 2 takes of McCartney's music hall confection, When I'm 64. Lennon's lysergic reflection on his Liverpool childhood, Strawberry Fields Forever, was started 2 weeks earlier, but issued in February 1967 as a standalone single. But Sgt. Pepper's real birthday is in August 29, 1966, when the Beatles play their last live concert in San Francisco. Until then, they had made history in the studio between punishing tours. Off the road for good, the Beatles were free to be a band away from the hysteria of Beatlemania. McCartney went a step further. On a plane from London in November '66, as he returned from a vacation in Kenya, he came up with the idea of an album by the Beatles in disguise, an alter ego group that he subsequently dubbed Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. "We'd pretend to be someone else," McCartney explained in Anthology. "It liberated you. You could do anything when you got to the mic or on your guitar because it wasn't you." Only 2 songs on the final LP, both McCartney's, had anything to do with the Pepper characters. The title track and Starr's jaunty vocals showcased With a Little Help from My Friends, introduced as a number by Sgt. Pepper's star crooner Billy Shears. Every other song could have been on any other album, Lennon insisted later. Yet it is hard to imagine a more perfect setting for the Victorian jollity of Lennon's Being for the Benefit of Mr. Kite, inspired by an 1843 circus poster, or the sumptuous melancholy of McCartney's Fixing a Hole, with its blend of antique shadows, a harpsichord played by the Beatles' producer George Martin, and Modern Sunshine, double-tracked lead guitar executed with ringing precision by Harrison. The Pepper premise was a license to thrill. It also underscored the real-life cohesion of the music and the group that made it. Of the 700 hours the Beatles spent making Sgt. Pepper from the end of 1966 until April 1967, the group needed only 3 days' worth to complete Lennon's lavish daydream, Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds. A Day in the Life, the most complex song on the album, was done in just 5 days. The oceanic piano chord was 3 pianos hit simultaneously by 10 hands belonging to Lennon, McCartney, Starr, Martin, and Beatles roadie Mal Evans. No other Beatles appear with Harrison on his sitar-perfumed Sermon on Materialism and Fidelity, Within You, Without You, but the band wisely placed the track at the halfway point of the original vinyl LP, at the beginning of side 2, a vital meditation break in the middle of the jubilant indulgence. The Beatles' exploitation of multi-tracking transformed the very act of studio recording. The orchestral overdubs on A Day in the Life marked the debut of 8-track recording in Britain, 2 4-track machines used in sync. And Sgt. Pepper's visual extravagance officially elevated the album cover to a work of art. Michael Cooper's photo of the Beatles in satin marching band outfits in front of a cardboard cutout audience of historical figures created by artist Peter Blake is the most enduring image of the psychedelic era. Sgt. Pepper was also the first rock album to incorporate complete lyrics to the songs in its design. Yet Sgt. Pepper is the #1 album of the Rolling Stone 500, not just because of its firsts. It is simply the best of everything the Beatles ever did as musicians, pioneers, and pop stars, all in one place. A 1967 British print ad for the album declared, "Remember, Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band is the Beatles. As McCartney put it, the album was just us doing a good show. The show goes on forever."